Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn on pandemic fad or here to stay, impacts of remote work on employees, businesses, and communities. My name is Brandon Hofstad, and I am the Community Economic Development Program Manager with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. It's my pleasure to kick off this webinar. Before we begin, I would like to thank the U.S. Economic Development Administration. Today's webinar was made possible in part by a grant from the U.S. EDA in support of the EDA University Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. As per usual, we do have a few housekeeping items, so everyone is prepared for today's presentation. First, today's meeting is being recorded, and final video will be posted later in the program. I'll post where you can find that, and then of course, if you're registered, you'll be able to access that in a follow-up email. If you need closed captioning, you can find it at the bottom of your screen. There, the CC at the bottom to enable closed captioning. And as a friendly reminder, please be sure to mute your microphones when you're not speaking, but also feel free to ask questions or make comments during our presenter today by dropping them in the chat. And then later, we will also have an opportunity for a question and answer. So if you feel more comfortable asking the question directly of our presenter, you can do so. And finally, if you don't feel comfortable sending a chat out to the entire world, you can send it to myself. Again, I should be at the top of your list, Brandon Hofstad, or my colleague, Kristen Runge, who also is at the top of the participant list. So, and now for today's webinar and our presenter. Today's webinar is a discussion of the movement of employees to remote work during the COVID-19 pandemic. And according to the Census Bureau, the number of people that working primarily from home has actually tripled between 2019, so just before the pandemic, and then most recently to 2021, which raises several questions about remote work into the future and then current state. Today, our presenter, Matt Curis, will share data on this topic and offer insight into many important questions on remote work, again, across the country and in the state of Wisconsin. Briefly, Matt is a distinguished community economic development specialist and an economic geographer. He works with many state partners and local communities in several areas, including but not limited to regional economic analysis, labor force research, socioeconomic impact analysis, and industrial or industry sector competitiveness. And as mentioned, Matt will be presenting on the state of remote work. So Matt, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Brandon, and thank you to everyone for joining me this afternoon. As Brandon mentioned, I'm going to spend some time today looking at remote work and how it may impact our employees in our communities, our businesses, and obviously our communities in and of themselves. And I think remote work is on a lot of people's minds right now because we don't have a good sense of how many people are still working remotely since the start of the pandemic. We also have a good sense of what remote work trends might look like going forward. So I'm going to spend some time with you today sharing some data we have access to, and then also open it up for some conversation at the end to maybe hear what you're seeing on the ground out there in the state of Wisconsin or throughout the United States, and also get your thoughts on what we might see in terms of remote work going forward in our individual communities. So let's look at some trends in terms of the share of employees working remotely or working from home between 2019 and 2021. So prior to the start of the pandemic, and then the most recent data we have for 2021. And here we have a comparison for Midwestern states and an overall national average. And what you'll see is that prior to the start of the pandemic in 2019, in the Midwest, we saw a fairly consistent share of workers that worked from home, 5.1% in the state of Wisconsin, 5.7% nationally, and then kind of a mixed bag in our neighboring states. We saw a large jump, obviously, between 2019 and 2021. We saw in the state of Wisconsin, we went from 5.1 up to 14.8. In the United States, we saw over a tripling of the share of workers working at home, up to 17.9%. And then we also saw some differences in terms of the gaps in people working from home relative to the state of Wisconsin and our neighboring states. We saw a place like Minnesota that jumped from 6.4% all the way up to 20.9%. And some of these differences we see are due to occupational and industry mixes that we have in these individual states that we'll explore a little bit more here in a minute. And if we look at how the change in share of people working at home across the entire United States look from 2019 to 2021, we see Wisconsin, the blue bar there in the middle, and we were, pretty much a little bit below average, obviously, but pretty much in the middle of other states. And again, we saw very large leaps in places like Massachusetts, Washington, Oregon, Virginia, Maryland, and DC. And again, a lot of this has to do with the industrial and occupational mixes of employment in those places. They tend to be higher in professional business services, higher in information, higher in public administration. And those are some of the characteristics that drove some of these changes. And they're also characteristics that we need to consider in terms of how we view ourselves in Wisconsin, the upper Midwest, in terms of remote work going forward. And a couple things to keep in mind when we look at this data is that the work from home figures that we get from the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey, they may depend upon when the individual is actually surveyed. So the survey question asks, where did you work the week before? So if you had perhaps a hybrid type of relationship or worked at home for 1 week and didn't work at home the next week, you may answer that question a bit differently. They also do not distinguish among work from home arrangements. So as I mentioned before, some workers may be hybrid, some may be remote in the sense that they're working from home, but aren't working from home in a place that they could easily commute to if they had to go into the office. They may be working hundreds of miles away or several states away. So again, when we look at this data, we have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt because it doesn't give us the full picture of how remote work may work in a given area. So obviously, when you think about working from home, individual workers have a variety of benefits and perhaps challenges that go along with working from home for some individuals as well. So not surprisingly, one of the biggest benefits that comes along with working from home is greater flexibility. Workers can choose perhaps a little bit more in terms of when they want to work and where they want to work. They may be able to balance childcare, for instance, if they need to deal with children at home. And certainly it provides opportunities to improve the work-life balance for many people instead of having to go into the office. It certainly is an opportunity to trade commuting time for other activities. So especially in large urban areas where you have significant commuting time, you have a chance to maybe work a bit more during this commuting time, or perhaps have leisure activities or spend more time with your family. We can also see, though, that there's potential positive and negative impacts on career progressions. So if you have the opportunity to work remotely, there are opportunities for you to expand your job search in many instances. So you can look at career opportunities perhaps across the country or maybe even across the world without having to physically relocate to those places. But we also see that working from home creates negative impacts in terms of career progressions as well. So it may hamper onboarding or networking that oftentimes gets you into the door for promotions or project assignments. This is especially important for newer young workers that may be new to a work environment or never worked in a physical sense at a given location. My nephew was at a internship this summer in Milwaukee, and for weeks he actually sat in a office building essentially by himself with the supervisor that worked remotely. And he had very little to do for the first several weeks that he was on that job and had very little direction in terms of what he was supposed to be doing. So it really did not provide a lot of opportunity for him in that sense. There's also individual work satisfaction considerations. There are simply people that really enjoy social interaction at work, and when that's taken away from them, they suffer. And there's also individuals that may be a little more introverted and don't want to deal with the politics of working in a physical office. So they enjoy personal autonomy. So that's a benefit for them. And there's also some emerging research that looks at how remote work may be socioeconomically divisive. If we look at the types of jobs that can be done remotely, and we'll look at that a bit more here in a second, they tend to be in occupations that are higher paid and also require a college degree. So here you create a greater division in terms of socioeconomic opportunities, and it may create some additional sorting in terms of where people live and work. So this is an estimate of the share of given occupations that can be done from home. And this is some work out of the University of Chicago by Dingle and Neiman that did this early on in the pandemic. And what they did was to go into a resource called ONET and look at the types of skills associated with all sorts of occupations and whether or not those types of skills and responsibilities and other work requirements could be done at home. Then they estimated what share of the occupations of different broad categories, such as computer, mathematical, legal, management, so on and so forth, fit those requirements to be worked at home. And what you see here is a distinct division in the shares of occupations that can be done at home or those that probably need to be done in a personal physical location. So we see occupations like computer, mathematical, educational instruction and library, legal, business, financial, management, and so on and so forth. Very high shares of those occupations that could conceivably be done at home. It doesn't mean they all will be done at home, and perhaps doesn't mean that they all should be done at home. So when we look at education, instruction, perhaps many of those jobs that were done at home during the pandemic should no longer be done at home because we saw the negative impacts that remote learning had on many of our students. We also see other occupations that have a very low share of opportunity to be done from home, like protected services, healthcare practitioners, transportation material moving, healthcare support, production occupations, and so on and so forth. So if we look at those estimates that we saw on the previous slide versus the share of individuals that actually worked at home by occupational category for the state of Wisconsin, we certainly see smaller shares of individuals that worked at home in some of those occupations than probably could have worked at home. But we also see the overall pattern is pretty much the same. We see a much higher share of individuals working in management, business and science, and arts occupations that worked at home in 2021 compared to prior to the start of the pandemic, higher shares in sales and office occupations, and much lower shares in service occupations, production, transportation, natural resources, construction, and so on and so forth. So overall, we do see a somewhat lower share than was perhaps predicted, but we also see a similar pattern to what was predicted as well. And again, when we think about the socioeconomic differences in those occupations, certainly those categories that had higher shares of people working from home in 2021, such as management, business, science, arts, and so on and so forth. Again, those are occupations that tend to require a college degree and tend to be higher paying. We can also break it down in terms of the share of individuals that could work from home by industry sector. So instead of just looking at occupation, we can look at overall distributions by industries. And again, this comes from the same report that I mentioned a minute ago. And you see high shares again in educational services, professional, scientific, and technical services, management, finance and insurance, information, and then lower shares in industries like manufacturing, transportation, construction, retail trade, and accommodation and food services. And again, if we compare the share that perhaps could be done at home compared to what actually happened in the state of Wisconsin, we do see a very similar pattern to what the predictions might have been. We see high shares of people working at home in finance and information, professional, scientific, and technical services, public administration, other services, and so on and so forth, and much lower shares in industries like manufacturing, transportation and warehousing, and leisure and hospitality. So again, these patterns that we see are somewhat expected. But again, we do see these differences in earnings. If we look at the share of individuals who worked at home in 2019, we did see a somewhat higher share of individuals that made $75,000 or more that did work at home in 2019, but we see a dramatic increase in the share of individuals with $75,000 in earnings per year or more that worked at home in 2021. We did also see some increases in the shares of individuals with earnings between $50,000 and $65,000 and $65,000 and $75,000. But again, the lower earnings categories tend to have a lower propensity for people working at home. We can also break it down by race and ethnicity. If we look at the distribution prior to the start of the pandemic, we saw a pretty similar distribution by race and ethnicity, anywhere from 2.2% of the Black or African American residents in 2019 working at home, up to 5.5% for white alone non-Hispanic residents. But we certainly saw big jumps for Black or African American residents. We saw big jumps for Asian residents. We saw big jumps for individuals who identify as white alone non-Hispanic. We saw lesser increases among Hispanic and Latino residents and among American and Alaskan Natives. So that's kind of a 10,000-foot view of some of the implications for individuals and what it actually looked like on the ground for individuals in the state of Wisconsin. We can also think about it in terms of the implications for businesses. So I think a lot of businesses out there are thinking about what work from home means in terms of how they recruit and retain employees. So businesses, do they actually need to offer work from home options in a tight labor market that we're in right now? Or if they don't, are they going to lose potential candidates to other opportunities because they do offer work from home options? There are questions out there about whether or not working from home impacts productivity. And there is some research that's emerging that's showing positive and negative impacts on productivity. And I won't go into all of this here, but a recent report came out that provides a good summary of this research for anyone who's interested. There's also questions about equity in the workplace. So how do employers balance who can and cannot work from home? So you look at an industry like manufacturing, where only about 20% of the people employed in manufacturing could actually work from home. So how do you say to individuals that may be required to come into the office versus, or into the facility versus those that perhaps could work from home? How do you put an appropriate balance on those opportunities for individuals within that facility? And then, should workers be fully work from home, or should a hybrid approach be adopted? There are some companies out there and some workers out there that are saying that, for instance, the hybrid approach is the worst of both worlds, because it requires you to live close to your facility so you can commute in, and you're not fully afforded the opportunities that you would receive from working from home. You also don't necessarily know what days you'll be working from home and which you may be required to go into the office. There's also emerging research about whether or not working from home reduces so-called knowledge spillovers or personal interaction. We think about knowledge spillovers in terms of how people communicate with one another and share information they may have or knowledge they may have. And a lot of these knowledge spillovers kind of lead to increased productivity. They lead to research collaborations. They lead to all sorts of positive economic benefits to individuals and companies in a lot of ways. But if you reduce those personal interactions, does it reduce these spillovers? So we do see some research that's emerging that suggests that remote collaborations were actually increasing before the start of the pandemic due to some of the communications technologies we have now, things like Zoom, obviously, that you're on right now, things like Slack, and then just other opportunities to communicate remotely because it was just simply more accepted. There's also other research out there that looks at reduced interactions among individuals in terms of what it means for perhaps patent development, what it means for interacting with different companies, with different opportunities for sales clients, and so on and so forth. And then obviously there's also rent and locational considerations. So if a large share of a company's workforce is actually at home, do they need to spend the money on office space they may already have, or can they downsize? Or perhaps if they don't need to be in a high amenity downtown location, for instance, that is often used as a way to attract workers to their company, do they perhaps consider moving to a lower cost location? So these are the types of questions many businesses are considering right now. And I think one of the challenges that businesses are kind of wrestling with is this tight labor market. So if we look at, for instance, job openings in the state of Wisconsin, going back to the beginning of 2001 up through the most recent data we have in August 2022, we can see that the number of job openings are at historic highs. They've come down a little bit recently, but nonetheless, they are very high compared to where they were prior to the start of the pandemic. So if remote work is a consideration for individuals looking for a job, it may put some certain companies at a disadvantage if they don't offer those opportunities. We can also look at it in terms of quits. We saw many people quitting their job during the pandemic. If we look at the number of quits, they were at record highs in the early part of 2022. And again, they've come down somewhat, but they are very high compared to where they've historically been, and they reflect the number of quits that we saw during the strong labor market prior to the start of the pandemic. And if we consider why people quit their job, this is research from the Pew Research Center that can ask people why they left a job in 2021. We certainly see issues that might be related to remote work opportunities. So for instance, not enough flexibility to choose when to put in hours, perhaps because of childcare issues, perhaps wanted to relocate to a different area. We all see these as significant major or minor reasons why people quit a job. And many of these could be related to remote work or work from home opportunities. Now, the question I think that we need to consider going forward is that, are we seeing a change in the labor market that may make it more advantageous for employers to ask their employees to be in the office? So here we're looking at the number of job openings by industry in 3 industry sectors that tend to have a large amount of remote workers or workers working from home: information, finance and insurance, and professional and business services. And in all 3 of these industries, we do see the number of job openings starting to creep down. So perhaps as the economy starts to turn a bit and employees or employers are starting to think about the number of people they hire, the number of people they retain, we do see the number of job openings in these industries that allow for a large share of people to work remotely coming down. So again, businesses may be rethinking how they approach remote work going forward. We also have to think about implications for communities. And I think for me personally, this is the one that I'm most interested in, because I think communities are looking at remote work as perhaps an opportunity in some places and a challenge in others, because in some instances it may have a positive impact on our communities, and in other instances it could have negative impacts on businesses and individuals in our communities as well. So a couple questions that communities may be wanting to think about is there going to be another resorting of workers in terms of where people choose to live based on different preferences? So do communities gain or lose residents based on remote work opportunities? And I think a lot of places around the country and a lot of reports in the media are kind of raising this issue. And I don't think communities have a good idea of whether or not this is an opportunity or not. In places that may be seeing an influx of remote workers, is there pressure on housing markets? So we hear stories from places like Bozeman, Montana, where a number of people have moved in from the coasts that had a lot of money, and they were able to buy homes that were available. And then as a result, it pushed up the prices for other people that already lived there and perhaps wanted to move from rental to owner-occupied housing, or it simply pushed up the price of their rental unit as well. In places that do have an influx, are there tensions between new and longtime residents? When you have all these new communities coming, or residents coming into a community, does the character of the community change? And this is something we've seen in a lot of communities that have an influx of tourists or seasonal or housing owners. So this is nothing that's necessarily new, but it may be new to communities that are seeing this for the first time. Certainly land use. If we don't need as many offices as we did before, we don't need perhaps as much parking because people aren't driving to their place of work. Do we need to reallocate land use to housing or other types of uses? Are there negative impacts on businesses dependent on an inflow of commuters? So if you have a central business district or a downtown that had thousands of workers coming in on a daily basis, and all of a sudden they're no longer there, obviously it's going to reduce revenues for businesses that depended upon those individuals. And it's going to have a negative impact on the types of jobs that are offered by those businesses. And certainly mass transit. People aren't commuting on trains or on buses and not paying for that service. It's going to lead to a reduction in funding. So let's think about this a little bit in terms of the state of Wisconsin. And what we see is a bit of a mismatch in terms of individuals who could work remotely, where they live versus where they work. So the map you see there on your left looks at the number of people who could work at home based on their industry and occupation of employment by census tract. And it starts at 0 to 500 and goes up to 4,000 or more. And there we see a pretty widespread distribution across many parts of Wisconsin, with the exception of perhaps northern Wisconsin. But if we go to the flip side and look at where people that could work at home actually work by census tract, we see a somewhat more clustered pattern. We see a lower share of individuals that could work in more rural areas, and a higher share of individuals who work at home in more urban areas. And even within urban areas, we see highly concentrated employment for individuals who could work from home in certain census tracts. Now, when we think about this in terms of what it might mean for individual business districts within a given region, we can localize this even more. So this looks at the number of jobs that could be performed at home within a half mile of any given point on a map for the greater Madison area. And what you see is that we have a number of individuals, a number of people who could work from home that range from very small numbers to very high numbers in certain areas that employ more than 6,000 people that could potentially work from home within a very small area. So we see downtown Madison, we see the campus area, we see a red blob out in Verona, which is Epic Systems. So if you think about businesses in downtown Madison, for instance, and the impacts of these individuals working from home if they're no longer going into the office, and we think about thousands of those individuals no longer going into the office on an everyday basis, you can think about the very large impacts it may have on the businesses that depend upon those individuals for their revenues. But I think one of the biggest considerations that communities are thinking about is how remote work might be changing where people decide to live. And in the media, you've seen all sorts of stories over the last several years in terms of the vast migration of over 14 million Americans coming due to the rise in remote work. One study showed back in 2020. We saw a report on CNN about the coronavirus is making some people rethink where they want to live. We see some cities that are offering incentives in terms of cash, that if you move to their community, they'll give you money if you live there for a certain amount of time, trying to take advantage of this remote work boom. So I think the question is whether or not this is actually happening, and if it's happening, where is it happening? And if it's happening, will it continue to happen? And right now, we don't have great data that will allow us to do this. There will be more data coming out over the coming year or so that will help us answer this question a little bit better. But we can provide some perspectives on how remote work might have influenced some of these locational decisions. First of all, if we just look at mobility rates in 1950 to 2021 and look at moves of different type, people that made a move of any type, people who moved within the same county, people who moved within a different county in the same state, people who moved across state lines, or people who moved from international locations, we still see a downward trend that started back in the early 1970s throughout the 1980s, and then has continued obviously into the 2000s. And if we look at the numbers between 2000 and 2021, we certainly don't see this giant uptick in people moving of any type. If we break it down in terms of people moving across state lines or moving across county lines in the same state, we see a slight bit of an uptick for people moving across state lines. But again, it's a much lower rate than we've seen back in the 1990s and even into the 1950s and 60s. And again, similar type of pattern for people moving across counties in the same state. So based on this kind of aggregate data, we don't see this giant uptick in people moving from one place to another. Now, that said, this is national trends, and it masks some of the nuances we might see in different parts of the country. So this looks at the net migration rate by county from 2018 to 2019. This is net domestic migration per 1,000 residents. The darker the red, the higher the positive net domestic migration. The darker the blue, the greater the negative domestic net migration rate. So we see some similar pattern, or so we see patterns across the country in terms of places that were having a positive net migration and those that had a negative net migration. We certainly see places throughout the Sun Belt that had positive net migration. We saw it in the Pacific Northwest. We see it in places of Wisconsin, throughout southern Wisconsin, and then perhaps in northern Wisconsin in many places as well. So let's step forward to the more recent data we have after the start of the pandemic. So here again, obviously we're looking to the years just before the start of the pandemic. But if we do the same map for 2020 to 2021, we certainly see some shifts. We see some places that had a negative net domestic migration rate turn positive. We saw some that were positive that turned negative. And we saw some that were negative that remained negative, and some that were positive that remained positive. But we definitely see a somewhat more concentrated pattern in certain part of the country. And we also see places that were receiving additional residents or had negative or had a positive net migration relative to where they were in 2018, 2019. And if we look at the correlation between net domestic migration rates for 2018 to 2019 compared to those for 2020 to 2021, there's a fairly strong correlation. Places that tended to be have a positive domestic net migration rate in 2018, 2019 tended to have a positive domestic net migration rate for 2020, 2021. And again, this isn't true for everywhere, but what this says is that what we saw with the results of the pandemic may simply have kind of exacerbated some of the trends we saw already emerging before the start of the pandemic. And again, this isn't true everywhere, but it is something to consider as we look at these numbers. So as we think about what may kind of induce someone to move from one place to another because of the pandemic and the ability to work remotely, obviously housing costs come to mind, right? So people may have been living in a high cost area and all of a sudden they can work remotely or work from home. Perhaps they have opportunity to move from a high cost area to a low cost area. So we would expect to see a relationship in terms of out-migration from high cost areas into low cost areas. Certainly internet access would be consideration. If you are moving remotely moving to work remotely, you'd probably consider a place that had good internet access in terms of broadband. So is there a high share of individuals that have access to broadband in the place that you're considering moving to? And given what this might mean for different definitions for broadband. So the current definition of 25 download speed and 3 upload speed, or may even want to consider places that have an even better availability of broadband. So considering the proposed definition of broadband at 120. So again, we would expect to see perhaps people moving to places that had better access to broadband or sufficient access to broadband compared to perhaps maybe where they are. We've also heard a lot of stories in the media about people wanting to move to places that have a high level of amenities, and in many instances, a high level of natural amenities in terms of lakes or mountains or access to forest and recreational opportunities. And one way we can consider where those locations may be is looking at the share of a county's housing units that are considered to be seasonal or recreational or occasional use. So obviously, if you're going to have a seasonal housing unit, you're not going to necessarily build it by a place you wouldn't want to be or a place that didn't have amenities. So this is a proxy for looking at places that may be have high levels of natural amenities. And then we'd also expect perhaps to see a relationship between people moving out of places that had a high concentration of individuals working in occupations that could be performed at home. So here we look at the share of individuals share of jobs that could be performed at home on a national basis. And here we certainly see patterns in terms of high shares of these jobs that are located in metropolitan areas, especially large metropolitan areas. We see the coasts. We also see the high shares on coasts that had high housing costs in the previous slides. So again, we would probably expect to see a relationship between migration and the share of occupations that could be performed at home. Now, as I mentioned before, some of the national average figures hide some of the nuances that we see in some of these patterns. So let's take and break it down a little bit more by different types of counties and how metro or how non-metro they may be. So let's look at these patterns in counties of metro areas of 1 million or more. Let's look at the patterns in counties and metro areas of 250,000 to 1 million people. And then in metro counties of 250,000 or less population. Then we're also going to look at some patterns in non-metro counties of different types. We'll look at the patterns in non-metro counties that are next to or adjacent to an urban area. And then we'll look at non-metro counties that are not adjacent to a metropolitan area, or those that might be considered to be a bit more remote. And if we look at the share of jobs that can be done across this rural urban continuum by these different codes, we certainly see a higher share of jobs that can be done from home in those large metropolitan areas and metropolitan areas in general, and then lower shares in non-metropolitan areas. So this is a starting point for us. So first, let's look at the correlation for county domestic net migration rates and selected county characteristics in terms of the share of population with access to broadband of different speeds, the share of county housing units that are seasonal recreational, the share of employed residents in a work from home occupation, and then 2 measures of housing costs in terms of median owner occupied housing value and median gross rent. And then let's look at how these correlations have changed from 2018 to 2019 and from 2020 to 2021. So first of all, we see that if we look at the correlation between migration rates in 2019 and 2021, we see a very strong positive correlation, which again suggests that many of the patterns we saw prior to the start of the pandemic were simply somewhat elevated after the onset of the pandemic. So perhaps not a lot of changes due to the pandemic itself, but more of an exacerbation of some of the trends we already saw. We can also see that we saw greater negative correlations in terms of the share of population with access to broadband, the share of employed residents with work from home occupation, median owner occupied housing values, and median gross rent. So there was already a negative relationship from people moving into large metropolitan areas that had high housing costs, and that those relationships were even strengthened more so due to perhaps the pandemic. We also see a increased positive correlation for seasonal recreational housing units, again suggesting that there is a greater relationship to people moving to places or perhaps staying in places instead of moving out of them that have a high amount of natural amenities. This is a similar chart for counties and metro areas that are mid-sized or from 250,000 residents to 1 million population. Again, we see a very strong positive correlation before the pandemic and after the pandemic in terms of migration rates. We also see a very strong relationship, and one that grew, or one that became strong after the onset of the pandemic for seasonal recreational housing units. We also see a fairly weak relationship between the share of employed residents from work from home occupation that was positive prior to the start of the pandemic and negative after the start of the pandemic. So again, not a very strong correlation, but one that went from positive to negative. But again, we do see the correlation between migration and seasonal recreational housing units and perhaps natural amenities as a proxy for that. So these are small metropolitan areas, so fewer than 250,000 population. And here we see a much less strong correlation. So perhaps what we saw prior to the start of the pandemic changed somewhat after the start of the pandemic for these smaller metropolitan areas. But again, we see how seasonal recreational housing units, the correlation went from almost non-existent to somewhat moderate. Here are non-metro adjacent counties, so non-metro areas that are next to a metropolitan area. We see a fairly strong correlation of migration rates before and after. But again, we see a moderate to a moderately strengthened correlation after the onset of the pandemic. And then these are for non-metro, non-adjacent counties. So here we don't see a very strong correlation at all. So we may have seen a bit of a switch in terms of what happened for migration rates prior to the start of the pandemic to after the pandemic. But again, we see a strengthening correlation between seasonal recreational housing units. So obviously, one of the common factors we saw across all of these categories of counties is the influence of seasonal recreational housing. And again, this is something we've known for a while. We know that natural amenity areas, high natural amenity areas tend to attract and retain residents. So that's something that hasn't changed necessarily, but perhaps has been even bigger draw than it was before. But there's also many other factors that could influence these changes in addition to the ability to work from home. So what we're not saying here is that what we saw in terms of these changing relationships is due to the ability to work from home, but just that there's perhaps an impact that arose from people having new choices in terms of where to live. So additional work needs to be done in terms of what influence working from home meant for some of these changes we saw. And then we also don't know whether net migration rates are driven by inflow or outflow. So it's just a net number. So we have a question whether or not people chose to move to a county as a result of the pandemic, or did people who would have left a county choose to remain in place for one reason or another. So was it due to inflow or outflow? And there's also questions of whether or not these moves are permanent or temporary. And for instance, if we look at the distribution of seasonal or recreational housing units as a share of total housing units for the state of Wisconsin, we see very high shares in places like Violence, Florence, Marinette, Oneida, Sawyer, Washburn, Burnett counties, and so on and so forth. And if we look at perhaps where the people live who own many of these places, this looks at the location of non-local residential property owners by county, segmented into different metro areas across the Midwest. We can see that many people that own these properties live in Milwaukee, live in Madison, live in Chicago, and live in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So perhaps many of the individuals that perhaps migrated to these places migrated to their seasonal housing units and didn't necessarily come and buy new property on their own. So perhaps as the pandemic eased, or now that it has eased, have these individuals remain there, or did they return to their prior place of residence? And some work by the Harvard Joint Center on Housing Studies looked at some of the ways that change of residence occurred prior to, during, and now perhaps after the large part of the pandemic. So what they did was look at USPS change of address requests across 2019, 2020, and then through the most recent data they had in 2021. And what you see is if you look at permanent change of address requests, there was a bit of an increase in 2020 at the onset of the pandemic compared to 2019. We also see a somewhat bigger number in 2021 in the early part of the year. But if we look at 2021 as it's progressed, the number of permanent change of address requests have actually gone down below where they were during the same period in 2019. If we look at temporary changes of address requests, we saw that big spike at the onset of the pandemic in 2020. But again, if you look at the number of temporary change of address requests in 2021, it's very similar to the same periods prior to the start of the pandemic in 2019. We can also look at it in terms of individual change of address requests versus family change of address requests. If we look at individual change of address requests at the onset of the pandemic, we saw a big spike and we saw them somewhat elevated for the first part of the pandemic in 2020. But if we look at how that trend has continued into 2021, we now see that individual change of address requests are below where they were in 2019. We can also see a somewhat similar pattern for family change of address requests. Again, a bit of a bump with the onset of the pandemic, and then remaining somewhat elevated for part of the pandemic, but really remaining lower than the 2019 numbers for many months throughout the pandemic. So again, a lot of change of addresses were likely for individuals compared to families. A lot of them tended to be temporary rather than permanent. And we've seen many trends return to where they were prior to the start of the pandemic in 2019. So what does this all mean going forward? And these are my thoughts based on what I've seen in the research and what I see in the numbers. Certainly work from home is here to stay, but the number of opportunities may vary in the future. This, I think, will largely depend upon what we see in terms of the job market forward, whether or not we have a recession and whether or not we see unemployment rates begin to creep up. If we do see the number of job openings decline and unemployment rates start to creep up, I'm guessing that many companies will pull back on opportunities to work from home. We had questions about whether or not people that worked remotely or worked from home had fewer opportunities to interact with their colleagues. You're already starting to see some businesses improve opportunities to do onboarding, improve opportunities to interact with remote workers and collaborate with remote workers through technologies, through new procedures. So some of those barriers that existed before may not be quite as large as they were at one time. You're already starting to see downtowns and central business districts adapt to changing consumer demands. And I think one of the reasons you already see them adapting is that they have done this many, many times in the past. They are used to responding to consumer changes. They did it when suburban malls started. They did it when Walmart was a huge competitor. They did it as residents came back downtown. They did it as young professionals wanted to make downtowns a preferred place of residence. So they're used to adapting, and I see them adapting again. Work from home opportunities, like I mentioned before, likely exacerbated some of the migration trends that we're already seeing pre-pandemic. But obviously we need more research to confirm some of these observations. High amenity areas continue to be preferred destinations, and this is not anything that's new. It's just that they may be even more preferred than they were prior to the start of the pandemic. And then if you look at relocation incentives for remote workers that are being offered by some communities, they are likely very inefficient. If you look at some of the results that you've seen in places like Newton, Iowa, like you've seen in Arkansas, very few people are taking advantage of these incentives. And those that are, in some instances, are people that would have moved to those places anyway, regardless of the incentive. So I think communities, when they're thinking about trying to attract and retain workers, they should build upon the amenities that they already have, the quality of life considerations that they offer, and probably rely less upon financial incentives to get them to move. So with that, here's my contact information, and I thank you all for sitting through a lot of data in about 45 minutes. And with that, I'd just like to open up the discussion for any input or questions you may all have.
Great, thank you, Matt. And if you are comfortable, please feel free to unmute and ask Matt directly, or you can also drop questions into the chat. Are you able to see the question, Matt? So this is, so I'm curious about baby boomer generation retiring correlation with your shift to north making their lake homes permanent.
Hey, Sean, good to see you, by the way. Yeah, I mean, again, that's an observation that certainly could be happening. We don't necessarily have the data to prove that, but if you do look at migration patterns by age over time, you certainly saw positive net migration of people in their early retirement years moving to many of those areas that had a large amount of seasonal recreational homes on a net basis. And again, maybe there's some anecdotes from people that are online right now that that provide some more insight to what's actually happening on the ground.
Thanks, Matt.
Matt, I'm curious, you know, as you were going through, there was one slide in particular that showed that the actual migration rates were declined over the last 30 or 40 years, or I can't remember what the exact point was, which was sort of a surprising point for me. But I'm wondering, is this like a tech and high income reshuffling that's occurring? I'm thinking of, you know, folks like Steve Case, who retired and he's now a venture capitalist doing the rise of the rest, and top talent is everywhere. And is this simply just reshuffling high income earners and tech people in particular, or is this potentially something that is going to, I mean, it impacts that all over the place, but is this primarily in those two fields or those two indicators?
Are you speaking about in terms of the overall trends, or?
Yeah. And the staying power of it? Is it just taking talent from places like Silicon Valley and sending it elsewhere, or is it going to, you know, shuffle into other places as well? Are we going to see it in other industries as well?
I think you're seeing it mostly in the tech industries right now, just because of the Bay Area being such a high cost area, right? So if you don't need to be in that location and do your business elsewhere that's lower cost, certainly it's going to be advantage to you. And it's probably a trend you're going to see among, you know, these high income individuals, you know, like Steve Casey just mentioned, as well as Elon Musk, you know, building facilities in Texas. You saw a lot of venture capital moving to Florida. But again, I'm not necessarily sure this is going to be a big trend outside of tech, right? Because of the cost of doing business for some of those industries, and some of those other industries being much more diffuse throughout the entire country that may be lower cost areas. I think the one thing you may see is that the mid-sized metro areas, those between 250,000 and 1 million, are perhaps positioned to benefit a bit more, because they do have a lot of the talent present in many instances that are needed by some of those higher tech firms, and they do have much lower housing costs and lower costs of doing business.
This is Cliff Albertson. I had a question, kind of an observation. There's about 43 counties in the state that has recently lost population, but our population in the states kind of remain stable. And I'm seeing remote workers moving into these rural areas, and I'm seeing some advertisement and outreach to try to attract. Public Service Commission's Telecommuter Forward program is one of those. So I see kind of a rosy future for remote workers and bringing people to our rural communities, which I think would be very good.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's an opportunity for communities to consider. And I think the challenge really will be what happens with employers embracing this going forward. You're starting to already see some employees being a bit concerned that they, for lack of a better term, had the rug pulled out from under them. They were given the option to work remotely and work at home full time. And now some companies are saying, no, you have to come in now. That happened at a number of companies here in the Madison area. It happened at other companies throughout the United States. So I think workers may be a little bit more hesitant because of some of those noteworthy shifts among large employers. But that said, if you do decide to embrace remote work and you no longer given that option by your current employer, you still can look for a job that offers remote work elsewhere, right? So whether or not that's a big shift going forward remains to be seen. And then I also think too, what happens with the labor market going forward? You do see a lot of managers and business owners wanting to have their people physically in place, but are reluctantly letting them stay at home because they have to due to the labor market. But if we do see an economic downturn, do those opinions change? And again, I don't have a good answer to that, but it's certainly something to consider.
I think that Matt touched on it. Is the wild card here is how our business is going to respond to this. Some businesses have kind of seen this as an opportunity to address labor shortage issues. For example, if they're hiring an accountant that's going to be doing kind of basic bookkeeping type work, it really doesn't matter where that person's located. And businesses may say that, hey, if we allow this to be a remote, it opens up the pool of potential labor. Other businesses they're just not going to embrace that. And that's the wild card, and we haven't really seen how it's played out. You look at Epic and Madison. I'm not sure if this is one of the companies that pulled the rug out from underneath their employees, but they were sending pretty strong signals that you could remote work, and they've kind of changed their mind. So it's really going to hinge on how different businesses approach this.
We have 2 questions in the chat. One, any thoughts on increasing demand for co-working or business centers as it relates to remote working? And then the second one is, are you seeing any evidence or research that indicate how climate change and extreme weather events are affecting remote work trends?
The first one in terms of co-working / business centers. I think a lot of people thought with the onset of the pandemic that it would be kind of the death of these types of facilities, right? No one wanted to go in and work with somebody else that may spread COVID to them in a closed setting or an open setting. But I did see an article just recently about how there is indeed increasing demand for these types of facilities due to remote working. So perhaps that blip that we saw in terms of negative impacts on co-working spaces was indeed just a blip. So if remote working does continue to be an opportunity for a large number of people, especially in certain geographic locations, I would expect to see, co-working business centers continue to see increasing demand. In terms of climate change and extreme weather events, and I do know there's a ton of individuals doing research on this very topic, and it's a little bit outside my wheelhouse. But I do personally wonder about this when you see the trends in terms of people moving to places like Bozeman, Montana, and Texas and Florida that have all had extreme weather events recently, but it hasn't necessarily, stopped people from moving there. So again, I'm not an expert on that topic by any stretch of the imagination, but I do wonder if there will be a tipping point at some point or not.
And we are at the hour, and I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So at this point, I just want to say thank you, Matt. As always, a wonderful presentation. As I mentioned before, we will be posting this along with any resources, Matt's presentation, and then maybe some other resources online that will follow. We'll post it after we get it ready for posting online. So thank you, Matt. I don't know if you want to stick around. If there's anybody else who has another question, I'll turn off the recording, and please feel free to ask Matt a few questions if you have any desire to do so. So otherwise, for those who would need to exit, I hope you have a wonderful day.